Well, let's begin by talking about the story on the front page of the Sunday Times this morning. A special investigation reporting that NATO is demanding the UK bolsters its defence spending over fears Britain is increasingly vulnerable to ballistic missile attacks. It's reporting it could be struck anywhere within the next 15 years. Paul, when we read this, I mean, it is alarming to hear the state of defence in this country. But I guess in some ways we maybe shouldn't be surprised by it, where a number of consecutive governments have just not invested in defence.
No, I think you're right. I think it doesn't. The problem with conventional defense, as opposed to cyber and economic warfare and those kind of things, it takes a long time, the pipeline, to procure and build the things, the destroyers, the aircraft carriers, and these kind of things. And that's just been neglected. It doesn't feel that long ago since I remember Gordon Brown was changing. David Cameron came in and he was sort of like talking about the holes in Gordon Brown's defence review when he was Prime Minister. But that quickly catches up on you. And of course, those people who want to do us harm, they're moving on. They're getting around the nuclear agreements by building long-range ballistic missiles instead, which fall short of those international agreements.
And, we've been speaking about this throughout the course of the morning. And one of the issues really it comes back to, historically, people thought that ballistic missiles would only be used in a nuclear capacity. And therefore, obviously, if someone launched a nuclear weapon to us, we would launch one back. We don't want to think about the outcome of that. But the reality is now that more ballistic missiles are being used, if you like, in conventional airfield battles, and we're just not prepared for that. I just wonder, Joe, do you think that we should be investing in that? Is that the right thing we should be investing in? Do you think that that is the threat we should be concentrating on? Paul mentioned their cyber warfare, for example.
Well, I think that's exactly the problem, Chloe, that yes, of course, we should be investing in it, and we should have been investing in this sort of defence capability. But as you've just said, and as Paul said, for many, many years, and successive governments, they've kicked it into the long grass. Because, there is, as people have been speaking about this morning, the end of the Cold War brought, if you like, this peace dividend. Nobody 5 years ago would have expected to see tanks and trench warfare and the sort of battles that we've seen on the doorstep of Europe in Ukraine over the last coming up for 3 years. So I think, that is a wake-up call. And when you look at what we are, how vulnerable we are, and how we are, as you say, we're fighting cybersecurity and fighting that sort of disruption, if you like, and that is going to get far worse and far smarter from rogue states or hostile states like Russia, Iran, and China. But you can't do everything, and all the time you're going to spend money on defence. It's a just in case. It's like the house insurance that we all begrudge paying, but we know it might come in handy one day. But the state of the public finances at the moment, it's a really big ask. But we are going to be under pressure from NATO. And when you think that we only spend 1.6% of GDP on conventional defences, and we have got absolutely no land-based air defence. And it isn't just about protecting us in the UK. It's about things like, our military bases in Cyprus, for instance.
Yeah. Paul, what do you think about that? Do you think we should be spending more on conventional defences? I mean, Joe rightly points out there it's only 1.6% of GDP. I mean, that's not a lot when you're thinking about overall. Trump's saying that for NATO members should be putting around 5% of GDP in on all defence.
Yeah, I think it's 1.6 when you take out nuclear deterrent and those kind of things, and you still got to, we're talking about an important thing here with ballistic missiles, but obviously the nuclear deterrent is still incredibly important. Others will disagree, but I do believe it's still very important. I think we've got to increase we've got to get up to at least 2.5%, but we should be pushing 3% at this stage, because, as I said, it takes a long time to build up our defences. We are entering a more dangerous world at the moment. We've got to see, and I was listening to other military experts just yesterday about whether the situation in the Middle East can be contained should it blow up into a wider conflict in the Middle East rather than a wider conflict. But those risks are there for us as well.
Yeah. Do you think, Joe, that we should be spending up to 3% of GDP on defence?
I think the pressure on us to contribute more is going to become unavoidable from our NATO partners. And as we've seen, countries like Poland, for instance, really ramping up their spending. And I think, we've seen what's happened in Ukraine. We are talking sometimes quite often on this program about the possibility of a negotiated settlement, which would probably mean Ukraine ceding some territory to Russia. Well, how long will that last before Russia decides it can creep a bit further? And of course, you're seeing bigger capabilities from other nations, like the Houthis, for instance, in Yemen. And when you see, I think John Healey, the Defence Secretary, had a bit of a wake-up call when he was on a visit, actually. And they sort of flew through missile attacks, not that they were being attacked, but the sudden realisation of how far these ballistic missiles can reach and the damage they could do. So I think it's one of those things. Yes, we have to do it, but the government has got to find a way to sell it to the public at the same time as we're seeing everything else going up or being cut back.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's details of that in that Sunday Times investigation. And it is quite startling what happened there when the Defence Secretary was around. I think it was around Cyprus, wasn't it, where people were sitting there thinking, gosh, we know this isn't coming for us, but, we are in the firing line here. I just wonder, Paul, I mean, some people will say, look, you as a Conservative government minister, you were in power for 14 years, you didn't invest. This is tricky now for the Labour government. It's, a changing world. Where should the money come from when there's this huge black hole that we're told about, £22 billion? Where should that money come from to get to the likes of 2.5% or 3% of GDP spent on defence?
Well, look, I mean, we haven't got time to go through the £22 billion black hole claim again, but we've got to actually grow the economy. We've got to grow the pie to be able to encourage people to invest in this country to then get more taxes in, because you're right, otherwise it is a trade-off against one public service or another. But in terms of selling it to the public, as Jo was saying when she was talking about the land creep, the land grab of Russia, what we're doing in Ukraine is actually, it's effectively a cheaper way of defending the inevitable that may come in China if they try to have that same land grab of Taiwan. We go into that situation. That's a massive economic global recession because of the our reliance on semiconductors from Taiwan, for example, and of course the freight shipping lanes around that area.
Jo, Paul talks there about growth to pay for defence, but growth takes time. The economy isn't looking like it's growing much at the moment, or indeed the suggestions are it won't grow hugely in the next few years. So where should that money come from to hit those levels of GDP we're talking about? Is it about borrowing?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, to a large extent, I think the Chancellor's boxed herself into a corner, as so many Chancellors before her and probably ones that come after will also, by saying, oh, we're not going to borrow, we're going to do this, that and the other. And I do think, I know it sounds a bit sort of nerdy, and it was always a Liberal Democrat policy back in the day when I was working for Paddy Ashdown, but the idea of hypothecated taxes, and you say, all right, we're going to tax, let's say we're going to tax, for the sake of argument, car sales, but we're going to use that, we're going to ring fence that money to put it into defence spending. The defence industry, make no mistake about it, is a multi-billion dollar global industry. So people who are making arms and selling arms are making an awful lot of money out of it. There are ways, I would have thought, with a little bit of imagination that you can do that. And Paul is right. And we all know that, the only way to get the economy going is to grow it. Well, it doesn't look much like it's growing at the moment. And the indicators aren't looking particularly hopeful. It may be that things improve in the spring, but as you were talking to somebody earlier, just before we came on, the hit to businesses of the national insurance employers hike, and all the other bits and pieces, and the cuts to so many services, and the uncertainty. And that has been inherited, whether or not Paul wants to argue about 22 billion black hole. The uncertainty and the turmoil of 14 years, and certainly the last 5 years of the Conservatives, haven't done much to promote business confidence. So I think we're in a very, very parlous situation. And the government, government is about making choices. And you've got to make a choice. Do you want to make the country safe? Well, that is the first job of government, is to keep the country and your population safe. But at the same time, you've got to fund education, you've got to fund housing, and you've got to fund health.